So yesterday I suggested that today's talk session, interaction, was going to be an exploration about the present moment. Exploration that hopefully allows us to touch into the awareness that is all-pervading in any experience of life that arises for anyone. It's what we could call a common truth. Ironically, when I move away from, for the teaching really is not focused on what we'll explore today. That's not the primary teaching. And so sometimes I feel a sense of, it's a shame not to focus on the primary teaching, because I have such a regard for the potency of that, of just that. But there are 3 or 4 subsets that stem off the primary teaching that are worth dwelling into as sort of adjuncts to it. So the primary teaching is essentially a conceptual framework that focuses around what the conceptual framework, in my experience, says is available for the human being, and what, whether we realize it or not, we're really looking for, which is happiness for the human being, and that happiness comes in the form of unbroken peace of mind. Unbroken peace of mind regardless of the circumstance we find ourselves in. And with that as the premise, there is a conceptual framework that is laid out that starts to describe what the suffering is, on what basis it arises, and why that suffering can come to an end, and how it comes to an end. And hopefully those descriptions become part of the human being's makeup, and they start to function automatically, not requiring someone to go out and work vigilantly, although vigilant sadhana can happen. When it happens, that's a sign of earnestness. And the individual doesn't do earnestness. Earnestness is a description of essentially a ripe, mature dedication to seeking, which is something that happens. You can't make it happen. And so if one finds oneself moving through life and a contemplation, a seeing, an impulse to sit and meditate, a whole range of things that normally wouldn't arise, and you find that effortlessly there is a movement towards inquiry, then, and especially if you see this is happening, I'm not making it happen, not me as the separate individual insisting I should be doing this for 6 hours a day, and so I'm going to, due to my own personal effort, make it happen. This is different. This is where it arises. You're walking down the street and a thought about something related to the seeking arises, and then the thought develops, and insights may happen. And so it's all a happening. So that's why the conceptual framework is delivered, so that it hopefully plants seeds from which a certain strain of thinking may happen, and that thinking can lead to insights. Now, here I go, I'm putting forward the framework. No loss. Thinking can be divided into 2 types of thinking. We often think thinking per se is the problem. Thinking gets a tough rap in some phases of the spiritual search. Thinking per se is not a problem. In fact, it's a gift. We've been given the gift of the intellect. Ramesh used to say we've been given the dubious gift of the intellect. the dubious gift of the intellect, because it's the intellect that can sort of morph into the doership, but it's also the intellect that can lead to insight. Animals haven't been given the gift of a significant intellect, right? So humans have been given the dubious gift of the intellect. Animals don't suffer psychologically in the way that humans do. They will, animals, people always get me wrong when I say this. Animals experience physical pain and it can be torturous, right? But animals don't have the intellectual capacity to create a narrative about why did this happen to me, this shouldn't have happened to me. And human beings do have the capacity to do that, because we've been given the dubious gift of the intellect. That intellect can start being a tool and be an essential part of the dissolving of the psychological thinking. So the discussions here are effectively new conditioning. The conditioning also gets a tough rap. And it's only a particular type of conditioning in the human being that is problematic. And in this teaching, that's described as the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes, seeing myself as a separate, independent entity in control of everything I think, everything that I say, everything that I do. And it's a overlay, an attitude, it's a way of seeing what is happening with a particular lens on. And that lens doesn't see things clearly, doesn't see things as they really are. And yet, if those are the glasses that are on, then the life experience that arises is going to be pervaded with the sense of personal doership. And that inserts a very particular flavor to the life experience. That flavor, because of that lens, is one we can say in general terms is one of separateness. That I am a separate individual entity, insulated essentially is, when we look at it closely, it means I'm not affected by life. I am my own autonomous being, and I'm not doing anything because of anything else except for me. So that sense of personal doership, without us realizing it, inserts a psychological insulation around the experience of who I am. It makes me very small. It makes my experience of who I am very small. The reality, when we investigate, is that what I am is never, in no moment, independent from the conditioning that life has delivered to me. So I'm a result of not being separate from life. So to the extent that we feel that myself and the other are separate, independent entities doing because of our own volition, then there is a not seeing clearly of what is. And that becomes the attitude, the lens that is worn. Now that belief structure can fall away because of investigation, the inquiring and seeing certain descriptions as accurate. And if a deeply ingrained belief that says, you know, I am the doer is there, and then an investigation that starts to demonstrate I'm not as much of a doer as I thought I was. That seeing has to, it automatically starts to weaken the deeply ingrained opposite belief. And hopefully, as we do this investigation, we realize that taking on a new belief is not really freedom. So what starts dissolving the ingrained belief that causes the suffering is a set of concepts, and hopefully we don't hold on to them as a die-hard would hold on to its beliefs. They serve a purpose, and then even those beliefs can be let go. So that's more or less a very summarized version of a conceptual framework that in itself could be expanded on quite significantly, and a lot of the talks are about that. Adjuncts to that framework are, so, if I'm not the doer, if everything is happening according to God's will, how do I live my life? So that's a whole different topic which delves into the notion of starting to live life according to what you feel like doing. Actually, maybe for the first time being guided into, and I'm not necessarily talking about people here because by default this notion of feeling coming out of the intellect that says this is how things are, I'm guessing is something that has happened for a lot of people. But if it has happened, you'd know that when you first felt and started to acknowledge something that was different to an idea about something, it can be quite revelatory. And as we start saying, well, actually, I don't want to live life from a list of shoulds and shouldn'ts. I've been doing that my whole life, and it hasn't delivered the outcome that is satisfying. In fact, I see that it's part of the uncomfortableness. And then we start seeing that I'm in a job potentially because I believe I should be doing that. I'm in a relationship because I shouldn't do this or that because it will have this or that effect on this or that person. And at some point we go, how do I know really that my idea of how things will turn out if I do this is actually how things will turn out? We start to realize that our intellect, in terms of being able to assess a system as complex as this, that is full of very complex human beings, is not something I'm capable of knowing how something is going to happen if I do this. And then we realize, but I live my life as if I do know. And what has it done? It hasn't delivered a sense of self that is free. It's actually part of the problem. It's linked to this deeply ingrained belief of doership, which underneath it has a subset, which is what I need in order to be complete. Outcomes, pleasure. And so we're continually trying to second guess what our actions will deliver in terms of outcomes, and continually trying to make the outcome the best outcome, thinking we actually know. And when there's a surrender, the thinking mind, which is so let's break the intellect into the working mind and the thinking mind. The thinking mind is the doership and attachment to outcomes. It says, what do you mean surrender and, don't control? It says then life will turn into pot, It's going to be chaotic, it's going to be disastrous. And yet we find that when the surrender happens, life doesn't collapse into a disastrous chaos. In fact, it sometimes often gets much more efficient. So that's a whole new talk. We're not going to talk about that today. We're not going to talk about the conceptual framework today. Another of the adjuncts is exploring, linked to feeling, but in a different context or with a different aim, feeling into the locked away beliefs and what we could call the traumas that were linked, put in place because of circumstance that happened in the past that were related to because of these deeply ingrained beliefs of personal doership and attachment to outcome, which basically means when something painful happened in life, a partner told you that you no longer sort of satisfied what they were after and that they were going to explore something different. So emotionally, that is painful. You know, someone that you care about is saying that, look, I'm heading in a different direction. However, with the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership and attachment, an emotional pain gets added, a whole load of shame and blame and attachment to outcomes gets added on top of the emotional pain. And that suffering, which is this extra load on top of the emotional pain of the circumstance, doesn't know, the body, because of the psychological entity that exists, doesn't know how to process it. Or rather, I should say, because of the existence of the psychological entity, the body isn't allowed to process it as it would process it if that psychological entity wasn't there. And because the psychological identity that essentially is the suffering, is the uncomfortableness with oneself, the uncomfortableness with the other, which ultimately is an uncomfortableness with oneself, because it can't process it, the best it can do is push it down deep so that it doesn't get felt. And that doesn't happen immediately. Over time, it does, but it keeps rearing its head, and it actually becomes part and parcel of the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership and attachment to outcome. So at some point along the process, and there are, in my view, phases in the process, and a phase can go on for years before another phase is relevant, and you can go through some phases where there's a switching between the phases quite quickly and intermittently. So at some point we need to start being able to allow the suppressed energies of past traumas based on interpreting life through this belief in personal doership to start coming back up to the surface and essentially being released. And the release, so just expressing, to me, is not really that helpful. So if you touch into these energies and they are expressed, if a new way of seeing what happened in the past isn't embedded in the body, there's going to be a lot of anger and sadness come up, and it doesn't really get transmuted. It gets expressed, but it doesn't really get released. So to me, the releasing is something that happens when the body, and there's a deeper intellect in the body, so it sort of knows, when the intellect is equipped with a new understanding of how to see life, and so that understanding is operating already in your life. So if someone hurts you, instead of seeing that as an attack on who I am, because pain is an attack on my core, hopefully there is a new attitude that is starting to see that that's part of life. The flow of life is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain, and I can't expect the world to always do what I want. And so when pain is delivered with this new developing attitude, there can be a relationship to the flow of life, which is sometimes pain, that is different in attitude to what we've had before, different in attitude to what was part and parcel of the locked away suffering. And so when the suffering from the past comes up because enough of the defenses have been, worn away, that energy will come up, and a part of us will see, it wasn't as personal as I thought. It wasn't about me. And that, to me, is the transmutation of that locked away energy, which contains in it the belief of doership and attachment to outcome. So it has to come out of the system. If it remains in the system, even with an intellectual understanding that is deepening of what non-doership and non-attachment means, we're going to find this continuous flip-flopping in our life, where we understand it, and yet a circumstance happens and we get triggered into the old pattern of doership and attachment to outcomes. Because on some level in the system, the doership and attachment to outcomes is still there. So satsangs are dedicated to what I'm talking about now, how to allow these energies to surface, what attitude can kick in while they surface, and why it's important. So I just a abbreviated version. So core conceptual framework, how to live life by feeling what I feel like doing, adjunct of allowing these energies that are locked in the system to come out, which only happens at the right time. You can't say today is the day. Doesn't work like that. Today's talk, another adjunct, which is exploring the present moment in such a way that hopefully a path starts to get forged between the head and the heart, where a resting can happen often and easily. Now, why is that exploration important? It might seem obvious. I mean, obviously resting in being where there is a peace is obviously important. Why it's worth doing the investigation is because the way that life, this creation, has wired the human being is in such a way that our vocabulary, our ingrained experience of life that has been received from a very young age, once the, what we could call the identification with the body kicks in at about, well, it starts from birth and maybe even in the womb. And as the baby gets more and more experience, it starts to know the body as itself. Because when it's first born, you can see by looking at a baby, their legs are flailing around and their arms are flailing around. And sometimes they actually, one hand will catch the other finger. And you can see in their eyes, there's no comprehension that that object, the body, is any more them than maybe a rattle or something. So it seems like in the development of the human being, the sense of coming into the body and seeing life from the perspective of the body takes some time to happen. And so at about 2 or 3 years old, the me and mine kicks in. And the tantrums because something is taken away from me that was mine. And that didn't happen before that. They could be crying because the baby was enjoying a pleasure and then the pleasure is taken away, and crying happens because the biological preference for pleasure and non-preference for pain. But that's different to the psychological me. So as a result of the way that life is experienced from a body that is seeing an outside world, and because of vocabulary, it's quite significant to get explanations of why certain things have happened. They're not absolute explanations, but they're good enough from a practical level because they come from observing and drawing conclusions, knowing that your observation is limited, so your conclusion is limited, i.e. not absolute. Right? It may not at all be like that, but there's no denying that the causal realm exists. Now, whether that's absolute truth is another question, but the fact is we're not looking for absolute truth in this search. For a while, we think we are. So then we think that, a conclusion about something based on observation is no good to me because I'm looking for absolute truth. It turns out these observations are very useful because we're not looking for absolute truth, we're looking for peace of mind in daily life. So, because of this formation, this forming based on how experience is received, how the experience is structured, is designed to create the sense of a separate subject and separate object, and because of vocabulary, and because of the way the intellect then locks in what truth must be based on how the experience is continually presenting. There is not the capacity in our structure to drop into being. So the structure needs to be disrupted. A lot of Advaita top-down teachings are doing that. They're disrupting the structure. They're not telling us the truth. I know a lot of people don't like to hear this.
I do. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah. So the exploration today will at times not be telling you the truth, but telling you what's important for the exploration. I have to say this because otherwise we'll do the exploration and it might be that certain conclusions are made about what we're looking for because of what happens in the exploration, without us remembering that actually this is being included because it's very relevant to the progression towards living life free of suffering. It's very relevant towards peace of mind. If there is a knowing of oneness, not an intellectual knowing, but an experiential knowing of oneness, and I'm using the word knowing just for the beginning of the exploration. That often is referred to as the absence of experience, because the word experience is usually used to denote subject-object relationship within the way certain teachings define words, right? And experience is also sometimes defined as ignorance, where one knows life from the perspective of a separate subject, aware of many objects. So that is what duality refers to. Me and the other. A subject and many objects. Duality. Non-duality is the absence of subject and object. The falling away of duality and the revelation of non-duality. And so the word experience is often used to describe the not knowing of non-duality. Experience means knowing yourself and life based on subject, separate object relationship. So when the knowing of oneness, meaning an experiential falling away of the sense of duality and a recognition of, let's say, awareness or consciousness in which everything arises that is not separate from that which is arising and in fact pervades everything that is witnessed, not by someone, but rather witnessing happening. When that knowing of oneness happens, here it is. It's an experience. It's an experience of oneness. What that means is I'm using the word experience not to denote the arising of life where there is a separate subject aware of objects that are separate from the separate subject. I'm using the word experience to denote what everyone has, regardless of what state is present, what everyone has in the waking and the dream state. If you take mushrooms or some hallucinogenic substance and the sense of subject-object relationship falls away, which often does for some people, that's not you seeing reality. Someone might say, yes, because if there is a you there, then there is still subject. I'm saying, let's say there is no subject-object relationship, there is just knowing, if we want to use that word, meaning direct experience not interfered with by relative thinking, and where the sense of a separate entity has fallen away. So, oneness, let's say, the experience, no, I can't. Reality, some people would say, non-duality revealed. What I'm suggesting, and I think it's very important for this exploration to happen in a way that least fosters misunderstanding as a result of the explorations. What I'm saying is that is a oneness experience, meaning an experience that is structured such that subject-object relationship is not part of it. So you can have a oneness experience, you can have an experience of duality. So you can have a non-dual experience, or you can have a dual experience. And when I say you can have, the experience says there is no me if it is an experience of non-duality. It doesn't mean that's true. It's an experience. So distinguishing what the experience feels like, which means what it's experienced like, that's one thing, because when certain experiences in life happen, and they don't need to be oneness experiences, there can be a sense of no person. Even the falling away of the sense of a human, like not just no person as a psychological entity, but even the sense of no person. So to make it clear, if you're in meditation and you're present with the experience, in closed eye meditation, most of the time the daily life experience is absent. So no trees, no cars or room. And if awareness is one with the experience, or if attention is on the experience and there is a truthfulness, an authenticity, what is in the experience, then there's no physical manifestation anymore, no time, no space, because time and space is a byproduct of objects, and thought objects included in that. Memory is a thought object that creates a sense of a past and a future. So if we're present with the experience, we have to admit that there is no one here if those components of the experience fall away. Because the sense of a person, the sense of a me, the sense of a world is highly dependent on objects. And then, because of the very complex psychology and thinking that associates and the attitude to the objects and what it says the objects mean. So meditation is often the absence of the world, the absence of time and space. It doesn't mean the world doesn't exist. So non-dual teachings, so when I also have to make this clarification, what I'm putting forward is a non-dual teaching from a different angle. I have a huge respect for Advaita. My path was to come through the path of Advaita Vedanta, through the teachings of Nisargadatta, Ramana, some of the Buddha's teachings, the Zen teachings. So I see them as absolutely essential as part of the disruption process, part of the change. If I refer to a teaching as, let's say, being very narrow, that's not a criticism of the teaching. That's a description of the methodology that teaching applies. There can be some teachings that I could say are well-rounded. Our intellect, which is very prone to polarizing itself with one end of a spectrum of duality, and usually polarizing itself with the one that it prefers or its preferences, says, well, if you said something is narrow and something is well-rounded, you're saying this one is invalid and this one is valid. That's not how I see life. So if that thought comes up when I'm describing differences, investigate whether it's a projection of the way you see life onto the words that I'm using. That's important, because I have the utmost respect for the way that the seeking unfolds. Anyone who criticizes a teaching is not, in my view, appreciating that we're always changing, and so we always need different tools, and sometimes we change so significantly that one tool stops being relevant and another one becomes more relevant. So the Advaita teachings, in order to bring about the shift that is needed, sometimes a very powerful axe is needed. It says, be honest, the world no longer exists in meditation. The world no longer exists in deep sleep. The whole world arises, the whole universe arises in consciousness. And in deep sleep, the universe doesn't exist, let's say. Or in the meditation, the person doesn't exist. There is no person. So if you hear that, try and hear it with different ears and see if what it might be saying is that in the experience, there is no world, there is no person, there is no time, there is no causality. In the experience that there is awareness of at that moment. So in this experience that there is awareness of, there are things here, objects here that aren't in a meditation experience. So let's realize that the only experience we have of the universe or of life is the experience that arises in this moment. That's really important. We never know an external world. There may well be an objective reality. There might not be an objective reality out there. So this could be a spontaneous creation in consciousness that is essentially similar to what happens in a night dream, whereby the universe in a night dream spontaneously arises as an appearance in consciousness, and there is no external objective reality of that night dream. Right? So let's imagine that we're dreaming, we're on a beach, and there's sand under the feet and ocean. That is what you can, looking at it from the human perspective that went to sleep at night, that is a spontaneous arising, an experience in consciousness or in awareness. And there isn't a corresponding external reality that is contributing to the arising of that experience. What we have here, our own direct experience in this moment, is arguably the same thing. It is an arising, an experience in consciousness. So in the dream, anything that arises outside of the consciousness of the dreamer is not part of the dream. It can't be known. If an explosion happened on the level of the dream consciousness, but outside the consciousness of the dreamer, let's say, it essentially wouldn't be part of the dream because there's no awareness of it. So it's not part of the experience. So anything outside of consciousness has, we could say, no existence relative to the experience. That's important because it might have an independent existence, just not within our awareness. So the sand and the sea in a night dream, looking at it from a perspective of a person gone to sleep in a bed where there's no sand or sea, is not a result of an external reality creating that experience. It's uncaused. You could say it's spontaneously arising and collapsing in each moment, and a new spontaneous arising in consciousness happens, and that spontaneous arising in consciousness is on, off, such that it is experienced as a linear, time-bound experience of objects. If you have a dream that sort of is similar to daily life experience. Now, you know in dreams some strange things can happen because it's an experience, right? So why not? Daily life. When we look at it, so an exploration of dreams to me is hugely helpful at understanding the notion of experience arising in consciousness. Daily life is an experience arising in consciousness. We often assume that we're told by Advaita teachings that there is no external world, there is just this spontaneous arising in consciousness, creating the illusion of cause and effect, the illusion of time, the illusion of a person. And that experience, when it arises like that, is maya, is confusion, is ignorance. It is the non-seeing of reality. Mm-hmm. So I hope we'd all agree that the only experience we've ever had of life is what's happening right now. So the experience of you blowing out your birthday candles at your 5-year-old birthday party was an experience happening in the now, let's say. And in the now, like now, here, there is an experience, and you may have a memory of blowing out candles when you were 5 years old. When you look at it with critical thought based on the experience, you say, I don't know if that ever happened. It's a memory object in the present moment. We can't go as far as saying, I know it didn't happen, just because we see it as a memory object in the present moment, because we don't really know why the present moment arises like it does. Maybe the present moment arises like it does because there is an objective world of time and space and objects that are received as stimuli by the body-mind organism that lives in that world. And then that body-mind organism processes and creates the brain, very complex instrument, if there is an external world, creates a very complex experience. And that's all we ever know, the experience. That may be a spontaneous arising in the mind of God. There is no world except for the spontaneous arising in each moment. So in Ramana's teaching, that's what he was pointing at when he said, what did he say? It's been a while since I said it. Well, someone can help me. It's been a long time.
I had a memory of
anyway, the point is something like before the manifestation there was nothing, then there was the manifestation reverts back into nothing, therefore nothing ever happened. Pointing at the fact that actually all we have is a spontaneous arising in consciousness. You start with nothing, you end with nothing, therefore nothing ever happened. You can't have nothing plus something to give you nothing. So that pointer is there to disrupt the way we know the world. The pointers that I'm giving you hopefully also will help us disrupt the way we know the world. Just recognizing every moment as an experience, like a dream, recognizing that I've only ever known life as an arising in the present moment, and that the body is part of the experience. That especially once things get disrupted enough, awareness will recognize that it pervades the whole experience, meaning nothing in this present moment experience, none of the people, none of the trees or chairs exist outside of the field of awareness. Hence, if they did, they wouldn't be part of the experience. So, if we can bring our attention into the present moment, because it's important, we need to know why we need to bring our attention into the present moment. Because it's important in order to understand what we are. Our attention hasn't been interested in exploring the present moment. So if our attention comes into the present moment and the descriptions about the present moment have been given as an experience arising now, it's a moving experience. It's not a static. It's more like a video rather than a photograph, right? So my hands are moving. You know, the trees are swaying. People are moving. It's like a movie. And experience can't exist if it's outside our field of awareness. That means that the whole experience arises inside awareness, not outside of it. If I were to move, or if an object was to be moved outside of the field of awareness, it would no longer be in the experience. So, if the field of awareness extends around and pervades the whole experience. Nothing exists outside of the field of awareness. The body is an object within the field of awareness. The body is not the subject aware of the other objects. There is a singular experience arising within a field of awareness. This definitely shouldn't be taken as an intellectual concept. This is a pointer for each of you, should you feel like it, to allow the present moment to be what attention awareness lands on, without any need to change it. Understanding that all of the movement of the objects is happening in that present moment experience, including any thoughts that might arise. So they're not physical objects, but they're a form of object within the experience. Emotions too are an object arising in that experience. If sounds happen, they are sound objects in the experience. Any body sensations are objects in the experience. So it can help to soften the gaze and to allow a panoramic perspective to set in rather than a focused perspective. So what that means is allow the whole experience to exist as a singular arising. So just like if you were looking at a view, a beautiful view, instead of focusing on one part of the view, allow the whole view to be what is seen. Some of it will be in your peripheral sight, that's okay. We can't expect it not to be in the peripheral, what we would call peripheral vision. But what is happening if we allow the gaze to soften and for the perspective to open up so that it's a more panoramic perspective? We allow the whole experience to be known. It can also help to allow the sense of consciousness, which is often located in the head, and that tends to create the experience in such a way that I, the body, is a subject seeing separate objects. It can help to allow that center of consciousness to drift down as though it's pulled down by gravity into the heart. This exercise doesn't require any thinking. If thoughts arise, see them as part of the panoramic experience. A multi-sensory thought and emotional experience. And you didn't create the other people. You didn't create the objects in this experience. You're simply witnessing them. And if the experience is coming from, is designed such that it feels like the body is aware of the experience, then try to remember that the body too can be seen as just an object like all the other objects in the experience. And what is seeing that? What's seeing it is the awareness that has taken a step back to a more inclusive view of the experience. Remember, the consciousness can drift down into the chest. Maybe the sense when it moves down into the chest, it's not even in the chest. There might be a sense that what I am is this formless awareness in which everything arises. That means your sense of self can morph, meaning the feeling, the sense that what I am is not located anywhere, but rather what I am is the field of awareness that pervades and extends to fill and encompass the whole experience. So the body, the person, is not what is aware of the experience. The body is just an object within the experience. If you find that the eyes close, then the experience has changed radically in an instant. Now, there's no need to assume that there is a person sitting in a room with many other people. No need to assume that there is a world outside of you. Being present with the present moment experience means see what is there now. Be present with the experience that is there now as an experience. You'll find it's a very different experience in content to the daily life experience, in so much that there are not the same objects present in what we can call the closed eye experience, the world essentially has dissolved in an instant. Thoughts may arise, and try not to project onto this current experience your assumption of what life is based on the past. Notice that there might be a carrying in of a thought that says, I'm just sitting in a room in meditation. That thought may be disturbing a full appreciation of the present moment experience as it presents itself. So that means be honest with what the experience includes, what the components of the experience are. So if there's a sensation that the mind is labeling as a thigh on the cushion, notice that if we are more authentic with an assessment of the experience, we know that there is an indistinct sensation in the experience. Labeling it as the experience of a thigh on a cushion in an external room is a lot of overlay. The residual sense of self is most likely going to carry itself into the present moment experience, which we can call a meditation experience or a closed eye experience. But if we see it as a residual sense of self, meaning an idea that I am a body with my eyes closed, then it too can fall away. It can be helpful for awareness, attention to land on what the thinking or the intellect might say is the back of the forehead or the back of the eyelids. And realize that actually it's a vast, undefined, timeless space with no boundaries, no edges. The sound of what you would call my voice is just a sound object arising within that space and falling away. Any sounds that the intellect might be saying are coming from an external world, dogs barking, cars honking, are just sounds arising in this present moment experience, all contained within a field of awareness. We don't really know what is causing them. Unless we think we know. And should opening, what we would call opening of the eyes, happen, you'll notice in an instant the whole experience has changed radically. what we call daily life experience has represented itself within the field of awareness. Maybe it's not as real as it seems. There 1 minute, gone the next. What remains constant is the awareness which is aware of the experience, not separate from the experience, but one with the experience, because the experience arises within the field of consciousness. Should consciousness disappear, the experience would disappear with it. There are certain aspects of experience that are essential for us to become aware of, for there to be an awareness of. Awareness and the sense of existence are two such components of experience, be it an experience of duality or an experience of non-duality. Those two components, awareness and the sense of existence, are extremely significant components. They're components that we may have not recognized that there was an unrecognition of for our entire life, or through the entire arising of experience. These components remain hidden until such time as there is a recognition of them, a spontaneous recognition. The awareness that is in the meditation experience is the same awareness that is in the daily life experience, or rather in which the daily life experience arises. The meditation experience arises within the same awareness that the daily life experience arises. The dream experience at night arises within the same experience that daily life experience arises in. So if attention and an ongoing interest in this sort of exploration were to happen, you might start to notice that experience has to be a non-duality. All experience is by nature non-dual. All components of experience arise within a field of awareness as a singular arising. That's the nature of experience. And then within that, there are some experiences of duality and some experiences of non-duality. But fundamentally, the nature of experience, whether it is experienced as a duality or a non-duality, is a non-dual happening. Meaning the awareness and the content of experience are interdependent and not separate. When experience collapses in deep sleep, the whole experience collapses, including the awareness. Now I know, I'll jump in before anyone else tells me that awareness exists in deep sleep. That's a concept, not the truth. There can be experiences of sleep where awareness of no objects happen, where there is an awareness that sleeping is happening. And that to me is a very subtle experience where very many of the objects of experience are absent and the background of awareness is still present, which really means the sense of existence is still present. And that to me is not deep sleep, but a state very close to deep sleep. A state of sleep that is dreamless, where the awareness that becomes aware of itself through a process of recognizing that it is always here can be recognized in the most subtle of experiences, being sleep before deep sleep. Now, if anyone were to disagree with me, I'd completely understand why, because I disagreed with Ramesh for years on this point. Until, like, it wasn't years, it was months. Until, as always happened, he said something that stuck with me and created a certain thought of thinking, and then showed me where I had a belief, and the belief was very simple. Ramana told me. You know, so it's true. And I had had experiences of awareness in sleep. And so I said, well, that's the awareness that's there in deep sleep. With a bit of critical thinking, I had to say, well, actually, I believe it because Ramana told me. I had respect for that. At some point, the realization was, I don't know that there's awareness in deep sleep. I know there is awareness in sleep. But it could be that deep sleep is the absence of both objects, the most subtle of object being awareness itself, or at least the sense of existence that is a facet of self, we could say. And how does anyone know that that doesn't too switch off? You can't, no one can tell you it doesn't, because if it did, you wouldn't know that it did. So any assertion that says something such as that is a spiritual teaching that serves a purpose. It will create a platform for which awareness can step back, because awareness in deep sleep is trying to get us to start to see awareness as that which is the ultimate. It's a useful methodology. So we have to praise it for that. But at some point, teachings will come in and undo the ingrained beliefs that teachings put in place. So Ramana said, use this thorn to remove the thorn that's deeply embedded in your thumb, but be sure to throw both thorns away, knowing that for a while you're not going to throw both thorns away. The concept, the spiritual concept, will get embedded as a belief. And then at some point, that pointer will arise when we realize, I believe what the spiritual teaching told me. And it drops. Another of these beliefs, so we're really, I mean, this may not be relevant till a certain time. And really, these particular points are not relevant for a long time sometimes. Another of these points is the sense that what I am, or the belief rather, what I am is something that was never born and will never die. That's a pointer pointing to the core of what I call the human being. Because remember, what we're doing here is an exploration of experience. And we can have experiences that reveal the layers of experience, reveal the components that come in to create the range of experience that we have during the day. If we have a range of experience, sometimes the experience is fairly constantly one structure to it, except in deep sleep, for example, the experience collapses. In dream state, the experience changes radically. So even if our experience in daily life is fairly consistently one way, we have this great contrast of dream and deep sleep, which we don't use. We've never really thought of looking at deep sleep, which is the absence of daily life, and dream, which is the absence of daily life but the presence of another manifestation, to start understanding experience and the components of experience. But it's there, it's an asset, it's an availability for our contemplation and our experience, our investigation, our exploration of experience. So in the experience, we can become aware of the awareness and the sense of self. And when we rest, so this is what the exploration really is about, resting in being. And there's two forms of resting in being. There's the realization of the awareness aspect of self, in which everything arises. And the awareness aspect of self has a formless nothingness quality, you could say. And then the other aspect of self that is recognized is the sense of beingness, or I amness, isness, existence. And the two realizations of those two aspects of self usually happen separately from each other. The realization of the sense of I am, or beingness, is referred to in Ramana's teachings as Sphurana, the bursting forth of I am, where the sense of beingness is recognized as an all-pervading component in all experience, be it one of a person, or when the person falls, the sense of the person falls away in the experience, there is this sense, I am, I exist. But the word I, when used to describe that, is not describing the I that is infused with a sense of personal doership, clothed by a body. The I of the I amness, the I exist, the impersonal sense of I am, is referring to an inherent sense of I, but not a personal sense of I, but an undeniable sense I exist, or existence is, or I am, I amness, beingness. All of these words that I'm sure all of us have heard many, many times is pointing to an inherent sense. It's not a thought, I am. It's prior to the thought, I am. That's a beingness. When we have the experience, when we are prone to drop into states of oneness, let's say, which are, as I hope this exploration has shown, an experience, part of the changing experience, not some reality. When that state of oneness, or state of witnessing, which is a more subtle state of oneness, is there, the sense I am is there prior to any thinking. And that is, those two aspects of self is what Ramana is referring to as the self with a capital S, a realization of oneself as the all-pervading awareness in which everything arises, or the all-pervading consciousness. All there is consciousness, all there is awareness. Meaning the whole experience is interdependent on awareness, and awareness has to pervade all the way through it for it to exist. And the other facet of self is the sense of I, impersonal sense of I. So remember, if thinking is getting too caught up on what I'm saying, I just allow consciousness to drop down into the heart, so gaze to soften, panoramic view to happen, and just allow everything to arise without any need to change it. Allow it, see it all as the experience of life that is always morphing from one thing into the other. We don't really move life moves through what we are as awareness. The experience of walking through a door is the changing imagery moving through the unchanging background of awareness. The self that includes the undeniable sense of I, but not I am this or that. So in the story in Christianity when, who was it? Moses went up and the burning bush presented as God. And Moses said, "Who are you?" "I am that I am." Not, "I am this or that." It's a way of answering a question that doesn't define, doesn't conceptualize and condense what this I amness is beyond the impersonal sense of I am. So often, if Ramana were trying to, or any non-dual teaching is trying to get someone out of the obsessive thinking that includes thinking by default, includes words in it, our vocabulary. At the beginning I said that the reason we experience life a certain way is because of the experience that we started having at a young age that continued to be consistent and told us this is reality, and then the intellect labeled it as it presented, reinforced by our vocabulary. And our thoughts are all based on our vocabulary that, for example, uses the word I to denote the experience that is ordinary and default in life, which is I as a separate independent entity. So in an interaction, if someone continues to bring in assumptions of life based on causality and a separate individual self, the teaching will often try to negate the validity of referencing oneself and life that way. Tony Parsons is a great example of a teaching that does that. That's a very narrow teaching, right? That has a great power to disrupt the system and create an awakening, which is the beginning of the next phase in the process towards a liberation. So it can start off with an intellectual understanding, then there's an awakening, and then there's a process towards the end of suffering. And awakening and the end of suffering are two very different things. But the awakening, and I guess the exploration we're doing here, can be part of an exploration that hopefully continues to happen. You can do it while you're sitting at the bus stop. It's not really a doing, it's a allowing. And then within the allowing, the quality of the experience might change, and then there could be a realization of some of the things that we're talking about, the impersonal sense of I am, the sense that awareness is not located in the body, that awareness is all-pervading, that everything is changing, and yet the basic nature of that which is changing is awareness. That the body itself is part of the experience that is arising and changing. And that often when that practice, in a sense, comes to an end and we start interacting with the bus driver, which can create a change in the experience again, we might realize, oh, look, the experience has changed such that I'm now located in the body, and which is not, that's not a problem. You know, we don't need the experience to be a witnessing experience or an experience of oneness. That's not what we're looking for. That's not liberation. Liberation in this teaching is not the setting in of oneness as an experience. In this teaching, liberation is the end of suffering, whereby the human being continues to live their life in daily life, doing whatever they need to do, and suffering no longer arises. This exploration is part of the disruption of the suffering. If we start experiencing changes in the experience, such that we might start thinking that's what needs to set in and be there for the rest of my life. So within this exploration, we start to come in contact with aspects of ourselves that are hugely important to come in contact with in order for a resting in the face of pain to happen, in order to have a platform in which we can drop out of when the thinking mind is running the show and there is guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation. A recognition that what I am is untouched. What I am at my core is untouched by the flow of pleasure and pain in life. So if we don't have a connection with this resting self, or if we don't have a pathway that allows us to drop into the core of experience, the core of the human being, then the notion that your happiness isn't to be found in circumstance is simply conceptual. As soon as you drop into your being in the face of a painful situation when the thinking mind is blaming, and the blaming stops and there's a realization, I am. It's not really as serious as I thought. I exist right now. Someone's stolen my car, and I am. And the more we do that, the more we know ourselves to exist independent of a specific way that life is. And that's freedom. Freedom from the flow of life. So yesterday I referred to a quote of Nisargadatta that my friend Gautam, who was here on the first day, mentioned, and it was appropriate in the context of things yesterday to say it, but it's not exactly the quote, as was kindly pointed out. So one of Nisargadatta's great quotes is, "When I know myself as nothing, that's wisdom. When I know myself as everything, that's love. And in between, my life spins." He also said that the river of life flows between the bank of pleasure and pain. The river of life flows between the banks of pleasure and pain. It's only when we get stuck on one of the banks that life becomes a problem. That means it's when we know ourselves incorrectly as something that is dependent on life being pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And there is an attachment to pleasure with the deeply ingrained sense that in order to be complete, I need the external world to be a certain way. And therefore there's a attitudinal resistance to the pleasure and pain of life. And so if we remain unattached to either of the banks of pleasure or pain, then there's no problem. There's no lack, because there can be a resting in our being that is self-confirming. Right? So when this pathway is forged, hopefully when suffering arises, there's a remembrance. My happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. And if there's an understanding, which the conceptual framework, which is the core of the teaching, which as I said is not what we're talking about today, if that conceptual framework is ingrained, we'll realize that suffering is a result of attachment to outcome and the belief in personal doership. So whenever suffering arises, the thought can arise, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life, which can then trigger a dropping into our being, and a little smile comes to our face because we remember and we know, I am, I exist. So, without this sense of I amness for ourself, without a recognition of the nature of experience, the dropping into our own core is unlikely to be something that happens easily, because, as I mentioned, the way that we've been grown by life, the structure of the individual is such that there is this strong attachment to outcomes, and that covers up who we really are, because it's been replaced, not who we are in totality, but the core of the human being. So, you know, the exploration said you are not the human being, you are the awareness in which everything arises. And I said at the beginning, it's an exploration, not the truth. That awareness, when an integration happens, is seen to be the awareness of the human being in which everything arises. If we're really honest, so this was what I was getting at as another of the deeply ingrained beliefs that happen as a result of spiritual teachings, it's an inevitability, is the belief that what I am, when we come in contact with it, right? When we come in contact with the formless awareness and the sense of beingness that is impersonal and, we could say, ever present in experience, when we come in contact with it, because the teachings have said that is immortal, or that is eternal, that beingness was never born and will never die. Right? And so when we come into a recognition of that and a resting in that, and we drop into it maybe many times a day, maybe a month goes past and the remembrance hasn't happened, and then it happens and we drop into it, go, here I am, the part which was never born and will never die. Now, why is that useful? It's because we're traumatized entities. Life has traumatized us. Because we haven't been in contact with this part of ourselves, which is far less susceptible to attack than the physical body. Right? And so spiritual teachings actually need to calm us down. They need to shut down the flight and fight mode that the way we've seen life is put in place. So if we hear, you're invulnerable, what you really are is untouchable. It's like, thank you. It's like, and it feels, there's a response. Now, is that response because what we are is never born and will never die? Is it because what we really are is untouchable by the flow of life? Or is it because it's brought a relaxation into the system? So, the Facebook posts that I put up, the most important ones get the least likes. The ones that dive into the most important stuff get the least likes. And I limit how far I'll go in saying things that people like to hear. There's a limit, but I can see that there's a zone I can put things, and they get lots of likes. If I said, all there is love, it'll break all the records of likes that I've ever got. So, I don't care. Rest in the being and see if it tells you that it was never born and it will never die. See if that's actually information contained in yourself. I was confronted with this myself because those teachings were very important as part of the relaxation, part of the exploration, part of the resting in myself. And peace of mind in daily living, regardless of the circumstance, became my experience. And there was a diligence that, especially because I'm in a role of putting forward teaching that requires concepts to be full, and a deep understanding of what teaching actually is doing, right? So I love taking the approach now of pointing out why certain things are said and why they might not be as true as we believe. It's not that popular, that part. Because it challenges the sense of identity that is still there, even when a very significant set of changes, which is leading probably to a very significantly improved lifestyle. So, or not lifestyle, but way of being in life. But to the extent that the conceptual descriptions that we have of life are out of line with what is, what can be observed, then there's still some misunderstanding in the system. And as those small things get dropped, there's more and more integration happens, which is great, because I maintain that we're not meant to live life as awareness. We're meant to live life as the human being, which we are. However, a human being that started off with a deeply ingrained sense of self, which was based on a belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes, a change in that, and then still a human being, but no longer with the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership and attachment, which then means living life, being lived, knowing that any thoughts, any actions, any movements are inevitable. The only thing that could happen given the circumstance, and I didn't control the circumstance, it's life happening. But accepting I am Roger, but the I is not the same I as when the psychological entity was there. It's a recognition that Roger remains as a form in life, that I don't know the same experience when someone hits a stone with a hammer as I know when someone hits this knee with a hammer. So there is a very specific self-referencing that is not the psychological self-referencing, it's the biological arising of life through a particular body-mind organism. Where was I going? What's my point? So there needs to be a clarity with the concepts that we hold, even if we're not holding them in a rigid way as beliefs, such that it matches what is. And at some point, I had to admit, I don't know that I was never born and I'll never die. Even while resting in that which is said to be unborn, it has, there are definitely certain qualities to it. Qualities that can easily lead us to say, oh, it's, you know, not born, because it doesn't feel like a person that pops out of another person. You know, it doesn't have that. So we, okay, this is Brahman, the source, that which is behind all of life. I don't like believing things. So I had a little dilemma, because my peace of mind, I thought, might have been based on the fact that I was never born and will never die. Which, you know, but I said, but I don't know that, so I don't believe that. And the peace of mind didn't go anywhere. So the belief dropped, and the peace of mind stayed. Why? Because the sense of I am remains. And then I realized, there's peace of mind because I am, not because I was and I will be. I am. That's the core of the human being that is untouched by circumstance. Meaning, if painful circumstance happens and there is a dropping into being, I find I am, even though someone has died that I love. I am. And so why I say the core of the human being, because I'm also that if a car hits, I'll get a broken leg, let's say. So I'm not untouched by the flow of life in totality, because what I am in totality is the body-mind organism through which consciousness is flowing. I am Roger, the body-mind organism through which consciousness is flowing, but Roger knows that Roger is a result of life and is not a separate doer in control of everything that happens, including his own actions, words, and thoughts. So if someone has the concept, and any concept, unless the dynamic of belief has been seen, will get turned into a belief that I am awareness. It's helpful, it's wrong. Right? So it's useful, and at some point it needs to be corrected. It needs to be refined such that we say, oh, what I am is the human being. I was born and I will die. And who cares? Because life is the experience that's happening, and when the sense of attachment that needs to, things to happen in order for me to finally know myself, which is what the attachment out, or at least be happy. And when we think about dying, we think about all the things that we're not going to have. Right? All the people we're not going to be able to share our life with, all of the achievements that we think we need so that statues can be put up about us so that when we die at least people will remember us and whatever. All that psychological stuff dissolves. Then there is the experience, there's the knowing I am. Life is an experience that is here to be experienced for 3 years in some cases, 40 years in some cases, 105 years in others. And when it comes to an end, that's the final chapter of the book. I'm interested in how the final chapter will look, but I'll know it as a final chapter, meaning the end of experience. And there's.
As Roger.
I don't even say that. Well, definitely as Roger. Because to me, Roger is dependent on this particular body, mind, organism, and consciousness functioning through it. And in death, the body is annihilated. And so there is no more vehicle that will infuse consciousness with the Roger personality, the Rogerness. So definitely not definitely, as I see it, no more Roger. If Roger arises in an afterlife, to me that's another Roger, not this Roger. I'll leave that life up to him to deal with. Right? So that's the likelihood, if we get serious with how life is, and we're not looking to be soothed with the notion of, oh well, but there'll be something after death. Right? When all of that sort of falls away, I go, well, as far as I'm concerned, I might as well live life as if there's nothing after death. It doesn't take anything away from my life experience, unless I've got a psychological entity that's freaked out about not being. Mm-hmm. If that's there, then we need some psychological soothing. But I have no experience that tells me anything about anything outside of this life. So if someone is meditating and they say, my experience is there's no one here, it's because they're not linking that experience with a particular body-mind. If someone were to come along, quite unfortunate, with a gun and shoot them, and the body dies, I would suggest that that experience of no one there would collapse. So the experience that we have in meditation is still an experience linked to a particular body-mind. The experience we have in life is still an experience happening through a body-mind organism. If the eyes get damaged, the experience is no longer able to be an experience of sight, because the instrument through which that experience is, or the instrument that the experience is a result of, even if that's not an ultimate truth, but at some point we need to become practical and say, actually, all of this is not really about understanding the universe, understanding whether there are aliens or not, and these dimensions and this and the Akashic records and all of that. Who cares? I mean, if we become practical and start looking at it as a journey towards unbroken peace of mind, which is available, because if you read even the non-dual teachings and you read with this in mind, and you read it within the complete context, you see that's what they're actually, all of the stuff around the side, which is included in this teaching. There's a lot of stuff, which all the periphery concepts and explanations, they're all there to eventually lead to an experience of life had by a particular individual without the sense of personal doership and attachment to outcome, which doesn't equate to a oneness experience, other than at any moment being able to see life experience as an arising within consciousness. So, it's not that different. But maybe the disruption needs to be big enough than when I come in and say, actually, it's the human being's experience that is arising in consciousness, and that we don't know that that consciousness that's functioning through the being isn't created in the brain. Right? It may or may not be. We don't know. To say it's not is just to believe a teaching that tells you it's not, because when you're present with it. So in Buddhism, Buddhists who I believe the masters have had the same awakenings that the Advaita masters have had. And in Buddhism, it's a personal consciousness. In Advaita, it's an impersonal consciousness. And in history, the two have been fighting and debating over simply a labeling of the one consciousness. One has been brought through a teaching that says it's an impersonal consciousness of God to disrupt, and the other one is become aware of your consciousness. It's very important, and it's a personal consciousness. So the debating is about something really irrelevant, because it doesn't matter to our own life experience. It doesn't matter to our peace of mind whether it's God's consciousness or mind consciousness, as long as the ingrained structures that create suffering when life is interpreted a certain way collapse. My goodness.
Unless we're talking about an afterlife, and we perhaps want to...
If you
we want to...
Can you just use the microphone for the sake of the recording?
Unless we're talking about... I mean, the Buddhist philosophy of personal consciousness is much more attractive, because the afterlife means that... Well, who still exists? Hold on.
Well, don't forget, they have the notion of reincarnation and all sorts of things.
Right, so I still exist. I can't die then.
Yeah. But when you look at the wheel of karma in Buddhism, the final realization is there is no one to be born, to die. So, you know.
Right.
So. Well, I spoke a lot in today's satsang. Well, I always do. So if we keep the questions to maybe 10 minutes, which that doesn't mean many questions if I'm answering the questions. Go on.
Okay. Yeah, I can relate to what you're saying, and it's kind of really refreshing to hear someone not taking a stance in the, which seems to happen a lot in the Advaita kind of, you know, this is the final. Like in my own life, I just seem to come full circle back to being a person, you know, through the whole spiritual. And I put that down to having a master, a teacher that kind of brought me where I lost all those concepts and all those ideas, and it kind of brought me back into being to here. Like, but with a tool that allowed me to feel, like I could feel peace. And the question that I wanted to ask, because I heard you the other day saying that peace is peace of mind is
the absence of
a
suffering.
lack of suffering.
Yeah,
that was it. But I don't know. I see it the other way around. That, like suffering would be a lack, unless we're talking about a different thing. But in mine, it's like feeling peace, which.
But you've never really felt the full peace when the suffering arises, because suffering by default is a disturbance of that peace. So you can witness suffering, and there's a great degree of peace there. Yeah. But if we look at where the peace is in that, it's in the space where the suffering isn't, right?
Yeah, maybe.
And so
but I don't think see it as a result of anything. I think I see it as a natural state. peace. And when suffering comes in the way, it takes you away from the natural state of what we are.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, this. It was quite a long time ago. I went through this process with my teacher, and it kind of brought the end of spirituality in a way. Made it.
It's just life.
So simple. Yeah, it's just life.
And why split into spirituality and work? I mean, no need to segment it into work and spirituality and family life. It's just spirituality is life, right?
Yeah, maybe. Spirituality is a whole set of concepts, or But after all this time, I just left with just peace, really, and all the rest. I think this is what your point that you're making, that all the rest can be just concepts and ideas to bring you to this point.
And once you have the peace, sometimes someone has the peace except for the idea that there's more. And some of the comments that I get that are most touching is people say, I've been seeking for 40 years, and it just didn't occur to me that all that it was about is the absence of suffering, peace of mind. Because there was always a seeking for less of a person, let's say, in a state to happen, and one day it will happen. And then they said, of course, the process has got me to a place of peace of mind, except for the uncomfortableness of expectation of something more. And so what you're describing, Ramesh, when someone would come back and sometimes they'd narrate shifts and things that had happened, really what he'd say, what he was interested, the only thing he was really interested in hearing is there more peace of mind in your life? Right? That to him is the practical benefit that can come from this understanding going deeper and deeper.
Yeah, I really liked the other day when you were saying, when you came to, because you explained he was the translator of Nisargadatta, his translator. You came to him from an Advaita, and I like we were explaining that he was saying, I'm just consciousness, pure consciousness, and he was saying to you, don't be silly, you're Roger,
That's
and
right.
kind of, I could relate to a lot of what you're saying.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Tomorrow, because it's not going to fit in today, it's linked very much to... Oh, sorry. Go on.
Hello. I just wondered, when you say that there is in sleep, like on the verge of slipping from sleep into deep sleep, there is still consciousness. But what kind of consciousness? I mean, you can't be aware of it, can you? Because you're asleep.
Well, so what the description is that the state of experience or experience goes through a range of daily life, dream state, and sleep state. But there's two phases of sleep. Sleep where consciousness is still the background, which means there's no daily living state. So there's no content of daily living. There's no dream content, and there is still the functioning of awareness and beingness. And then at a certain point, it's a concept, right? Because in the same way as I said, someone can't tell you that they know that there is awareness in deep sleep. We can't know that there isn't awareness in deep sleep. However, as it appears, and appears from an investigation that's not so confused with what's what, as it appears, it seems like we go into deep sleep where there is no awareness. So what it means is that in the sleep state where there is awareness, the objects of consciousness are getting less and less and less. So the objects that fill the experience are getting less and less and less. The primary object in consciousness, or the primary object in experience, is the sense of I amness and awareness of that sense of I amness. That, it would be argued that is not an object. But when we look at it this way, we say, oh, the primary object is the sense of I amness. And if there's an object, then there is awareness. If the objects all fall away, including the primary object of I amness, then awareness falls away with it. So this explanation just wasn't palatable to me because I had the ingrained belief that no, there is awareness in deep sleep. And Ramesh said to me, which I don't necessarily think is going to have the same effect unless someone is in exactly the same point, he said, if there is nothing to experience or nothing to witness, where is the question of consciousness? And that stuck with me for a few days. At some point I realized, that experience, the content and the awareness are not two. You know, at the early stages of awakening, it's referred to as the background of awareness and all of the contents as something separate. And then there is a merging where we realize that the awareness and the objects are not separate. And it took me a while for my concept to match up with that realization, because if that's the case, if all of the objects collapse, then the awareness, which is not separate from the objects, have to collapse with the objects of experience. And the very finest object of experience that I'm suggesting is the sense of I am. And in deep sleep, I say that sense of I am collapses, therefore awareness is not required, it's not about required, it can't be, because there is nothing to be aware of. And that is, in fact, it's perfect when you look at it. It's a complete nothing, even the absence of awareness. That's the complete absence. So Wei Wu Wei would say there is the presence of presence, that's daily living state, the presence of absence, which is awareness of nothing, and then the ultimate is where there is the absence of presence. That's complete negation down to the absence of awareness. And if you look in certain scriptures and Bibles, and there are references where in the potential state, source in its potential state is not even aware of itself. So that's deep sleep, the complete absence, where source is not even aware of itself. And the state just before that would be awareness of a sleep state that where source is in the most basic of manifest form.
I agree, yeah, that can be experienced. I had my experience, but in deep sleep, that is just a concept, as you said, because you cannot experience.
Yeah, if someone says they have experienced awareness in deep sleep, I say that's just the stage of sleep before deep sleep.
Yeah.
And if they say no, that was deep sleep, that's just a concept that they're applying to that state, a label that is the different label that I would apply to that state. It's not that important unless it feels to someone, oh, this is something I need to think about. Because yeah. So in closing, tomorrow I would like to talk about another exercise that parallels in with today's talk, which is a dropping into I amness. Today we explored awareness more so. And I find that if we're going to integrate back into a person, because the awareness tends to be very expansive and tends to be non-localized and does deliver the sense of being nothing. The everything, maybe, is dropping into beingness. And so Nisargadatta said he met his guru, Siddharameshwar Maharaj, and his guru said, abide in I am. That was the only instruction. Nisargadatta was a bhakti before meeting Siddharameshwar Maharaj, meaning devotional. So when his guru gave him the instruction, that was it. I will abide in I am. See, after 4 years of abiding in I am, the self was realized. Because the self is one with the I am. So the dropping into being, which is complemented or is part of the recognition when suffering is there, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. That's a reminder. And the thought I am can arise. This is the thought I am, can be like the bookend to the suffering thinking that's happening. And then the thought, just when it's recognized that this thinking is suffering, the thought I am arises. It cuts off the suffering thinking that's happening. And it's the link between thought and dropping into being. So I am is just a prompt that, so within the I am is the understanding. This suffering is about attachment to outcome. It's blaming the other, it's blaming myself about something that happened that I think was my doing or their doing that delivered pain. Attachment to outcome and doership. That's what the psychological suffering that extends horizontally in time and disturbs our peace of mind is. And I am is the recognition, this is suffering based on the idea that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, that I'm the doer, the other's the doer. My happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, and I am.
When you said before, using the term dropping into being. Microphone.
Yeah.
When you said before,
Oh no, it's off. I switched it off.
when you used the phrase dropping into being before, can you clarify what you meant in the context of the other phrases you've used, such as awareness, awareness of no objects, the absence of awareness of no objects. You've also used the sense of being, the sense of I. So within the smorgasbord of terms that you used, what do you mean when you say dropping into the sense of being?
So that is not something that the doer can do. It's something that can happen, and it's a happening really according to our developing understanding about suffering and what it contributes into our life, and hopefully having come in contact with this sense of I amness, which is a formless aspect of the human being, consciousness, you could say. So the dropping into being is something that, in a sense, only happens if that space, that core of the human being, the consciousness of the human being, is accessible. Meaning, if the thinking, which is like a flywheel, you know, that has this great weight behind it, if all the changes have resulted in a shifting of the balance of power, where the psychological thinking, what I would call the thinking mind, the suffering, if that is cut off by the arising of the sense of, or by the thought I am, which is just a reminder to drop into, and so it's not someone doesn't drop in, essentially it is the stop and drop, meaning the thinking stops, the thinking that when it's happening there usually is a strong involvement in, so there is sort of the me is contained within the thoughts. You know, why did that person do it to me? So the thinking contains the small sense of self, and the dropping into I am sort of denotes a spontaneous cutting of that thinking, mid-sentence even, because the system knows that this is actually a complete waste of energy, and now awareness has seen that that's what's happening, and so a stop and what I would call, or can call, a dropping out of the head into this more open sense of self.
And would you say that that more open sense of self is an object?
No, that would be what, if we're investigating the experience, we can start off by not calling it an object, because we want the realization of the awareness as sort of, so we need to create a distinction, objects versus that which we are. You know, so the process of neti is not this, not that. I am not that object. I'm not that object. So so the initial stages would be of negating objects and being told what you are is what's left. But as we explore further and further, I would say that the sense of I am, which is sort of like two sides of the coin of awareness, is the sense of I am can be observed as an object, although a very intangible object. So a formless object that, depending on what definition or sense one has, it can sort of morph between object and not object.
I guess the reason I ask that is because when you mention dropping into a sense of being, you also mention there's confirmation of that. Once that occurs, there's a knowing in some way that that has occurred. And so, which is different from your discussion of deep sleep, because I seem to hear that in deep sleep it's impossible to be aware of truly what is deep sleep, but then there is a confirmation of dropping into your being, and I'm just trying to, from that, see when you use the word being and dropping into your being, that it's something already emanated from what you would call deep sleep, the absence of knowing, the absence of objects.
Yeah, so I would say in deep sleep we could call that source in potential form, and then anything in the manifestation is potential actualizing into manifest. And so when we drop into being in daily living, it's a dropping into a component, in a sense, of the manifest. And so I don't really say it's impossible to know something in deep sleep, because I know those might be the words, but really I'm only saying that as a counter to an ingrained belief of the opposite. Actually, I don't know would be what I would walk through the world with. But in a teaching context, if someone says, you know, I am awareness, I'd say, well, you're the body. If someone says, I'm the body, you are awareness.
Yeah, and I guess from that, what I was trying to determine in your teaching and in your experience, while we're in the, is presence or source before it's potentialized in the unmanifest knowable?
No, I would say it's not knowable by anyone. Or so, you know, this goes into the topic of what we're really looking for, because at a certain point we think, oh, what this search is about is merging with the source and knowing myself as source. And so we're trying to know the unknowable. And we have an expectation that one day in meditation, things will become so still and so quiet, and there'll be this, not to anyone, but something will happen, and the void will be known, which to me is a oxymoron. No, it's not. Yes, it's. Yeah, an oxymoron in a way, that it's trying to know the unknowable, and then we have there's still an idea. Oh, but I as the me, the person, won't know it. So it is knowable, but not by me. And I'm suggesting that it's completely unknowable even by source itself, because source is in its potential form, and it is because we know that the potential becomes the manifest.
Yeah, and no, I agree completely with you that trying to determine how many angels can dance on the head of the pin is, on a practical level, is not too useful. But there's something intuitive that, for me, if you ask somebody, did you cease to exist during deep sleep, almost without thinking, the answer will be no. There's some sort of intuitive knowing of a continuity of existence, even though there is deep sleep and a complete absence of objects. So to me, there seems to be some access to information somewhere that is very direct. And so that's why I was asking these questions, and there was a curiosity about them.
Right, yeah. So I said the human being still exists while deep sleep is happening in the bed. It's just the experience goes to the absence of everything. So maybe this intuitive knowing that we attribute, must be there because there must be awareness in deep sleep, might actually be the fact that the human being is lying in bed and is still alive. And that might be the reason why this intuitive continuity is there. So if we look at it from a perspective that life is actually, and consciousness is generated from the brain, which is something we can't dismiss, unless we fall into the trap of belief, that because we believe a teaching that says it's not, which is saying that because it's helpful to say that, and for someone to, because it disrupts what is normal. So if we go to the idea that maybe there is a human being and consciousness is created in the brain, and actually who cares, because what we're really looking for in practical terms is peace of mind, which can come not knowing where it's from, then we have to be open to the fact that maybe things are not really as described in the non-dual teachings. So, yeah. Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.